This video is sponsored by Miclay, and from the 22nd to the 29th of November, Miclay will be holding a Black Friday sale where all items will be 50% off, with 10% of all sales being donated to Solar Aid. So head on over to miclay.co.uk. This is China, the most recent nation to feature on the world's list of superpowers. Home to more than 1.4 billion people and an economy that's exploded in the last few decades, China has made quite a name for itself, single-handedly changing the global economy. But most of you know the story, the rise of China, once a very impoverished nation in the mid-20th century, to a significant driver of global economic growth. So today we are going to have a look at China before the boom, in order to understand at a deeper level how China's economy became what it is today. So, in order to find out more, we must first start with China's past. Welcome to China before the boom. China has long been an economic heavyweight, centuries before its re-emergence in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In fact, about 200 years ago, in the 1820s, it was home to a larger share of the global economy than the USA is home today. But for the sake of a YouTube video trying to merge thousands of years of history, I'll be splitting China's economic history into 3 parts. 1. Before the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. 2. Instability of the first half of the 20th century. And 3. Before the boom. So, without delaying any further, let's jump right into it. Okay, so the Qing dynasty, for those who don't know, was the last dynasty in a series of dynasties in the imperial history of China. And it ruled over China for a long time, almost 270 years. At the beginning of its rule, the economy was in serious trouble, with many people starving to death in the 1640s and 1650s. The poor state of the economy had multiple contributors. Firstly, there was a lot of internal conflict, as the Qing dynasty was still in the process of fighting the preceding Ming dynasty and the various other rebel powers across different provinces. Secondly, some poor harvests meant that some basic foods were just not readily available, and, as mentioned before, many sadly starved to death, or, as a cold-hearted economist would say, there was a reduction in the working age population. And thirdly, many policies, such as the Haijin, or the Great Clearance, caused negative impacts on China's coastal trading points. The Great Clearance was a series of isolationist policies that prevented people from living and trading via coastal towns. The policies were put in place to tackle Japanese piracy, but in reality it just led to many of those who were dispossessed by the policy of living near the coast participating in smuggling and piracy, and of course the policies also reduced international trade, which slowed down innovation. However, as power was consolidated, politically, economic activity improved. Inter-regional trade grew, and the Haijin policies were revoked by the then Kangxi emperor. This saw a period of prosperity emerge in China. Foreign foods like the potato were introduced thanks to international trade, some of which came through Macau, controlled by the Portuguese. Merchants became more powerful, and the regions of Xinjiang and Mongolia were integrated into the Chinese economy. To help increase market participation of a rapidly growing Chinese population, the Qing dynasty reduced and reformed taxes. As for exports, things were going well. China had a trade surplus with Western countries, exporting products like tea, silk, and manufactured goods. This saw silver rush into the country and expand the money supply. In fact, silver was often used as a form of currency, with farmers growing cash crops and selling them for silver in markets. On the whole, the Chinese textiles industry was strong and wealthy merchants emerged, but with Qing officials keeping limitations in place as they were concerned by the power obtained from such wealth. Despite all these successes though in the 17th and 18th centuries, there were definitely some shocks along the way. For example, the successful trade with the Europeans did get China involved in the Opium Wars with the British and French. This saw trade treaties signed in favour of the Europeans and more coastal towns open for business. This exposure to foreigners did have an economic impact too. Cities like Shanghai and Hong Kong, which were more connected to the global economy, experienced a period of modernization, but on the whole, China had been left behind. And this saw China's global economic weight shrink significantly in the mid to late 19th century, with the Taiping Rebellion, also known as one of the most deadly civil wars to take place, compounding with the wars and treaties signed with foreigners. And let's not forget that this was in combination with the fact that the Industrial Revolution had begun to take place across Europe and North America, drastically shifting the global economic weight towards the West. And from here we move into the next chapter in China's economic history. Once the Qing dynasty had fallen, China entered a state of chaos. It was facing regional warlords fighting for power in many parts of the country, not to mention Japanese aggression and invasion of Chinese territory. Oh, and a civil war, just to make sure things were real bad. For the economy, this was all terrible news. The political environment put the brakes on many developments within the country. But despite this, economic growth was still taking place, just at a slower rate. Some economists put this down to the fact that a market economy was in place until the mid-1930s. The agricultural sector, for example, was producing significant amounts of cash crops for exportation to foreign markets. Peanuts, tobacco and sugarcane were among the popular exports. But overall, it's quite hard to comprehend the scale of the conflicts and political and economic events that were taking place in these decades, since they varied in severity across, let's remember, a massive country that was already home to 500 million people. Towards the late 1930s and early 1940s, when the Japanese invaded, the Chinese economy shifted massively, like most wartime economies do. The government got heavily involved. In fact, within 6 years, from 1936 until 1942, the industries that were Chinese government owned grew from industries representing 15% of GDP to 70%. And, as some of you will know, in 1949 the Chinese Communist Party came to control mainland China, and with that said comes the third part of our video. So, following the Chinese Civil War and the Second Sino-Japanese War, China was once again in a mess, but this time more of a consolidated nation than previously. Machinery had been destroyed, transport links damaged, and in general a lot of infrastructure had been ruined beyond repair. In fact, some of the machinery in the northeast had even been taken apart and shipped to the Soviet Union by Soviet troops. What nice friends. Now, China at the time did take swift action. It did its best to repair communication and transport links to help get economic activity flowing again. And this was done in tandem with the banking system being nationalized and centralized. Landowners also saw reforms as part of a massive program which saw titles from about 45% of all arable land redistributed from landlords, as well as rich farmers, to mainly farm families, which were then strongly encouraged to cooperate with the Chinese government with regards to their agricultural production. All in all, the government at the time more or less achieved what it had set out to do economically. That's to normalize and stabilize the Chinese economy. But in the 1950s, more was to be achieved, and now China looked towards its first 5-year plan. Now, the 5-year plan was a Soviet economic model that was adopted as the Chinese Communist Party was looking at industrializing the nation. And many scientists, technicians, and other professionals came from the Soviet Union to help draw up and execute the plan. For the most part, the first 5-year plan was successful. The industrialization of the Chinese economy was taking place. Heavy industries like cement production, coal mining, and steel manufacturing saw significant growth. However, this love affair didn't last long, as by the end of the 1950s, Chinese officials were concerned about the slow growth of the agricultural sector. Their main concern was about food security. Was the production of agricultural produce in rural areas traded by state firms sufficient for the consumption for those in urban settings? Discontent with the Soviet economic approach, the Chinese authorities decided that the highly centralized approach in the agricultural sector was not well suited for China, and therefore a more regional form of economic governance should take place. This then led to the infamous Great Leap Forward, which in short was a massive failure that saw tens of millions of Chinese die of famine. Now, the Great Leap Forward is a topic that deserves a whole separate video. So in short, I will massively simplify it by saying that the goal of the Great Leap Forward was to speedrun Chinese productivity so that it would be productive. Programs that looked at creating the capital needed to be productive resulted in the misuse of resources, like labor. And although agricultural and industrial production did increase drastically for the first year, it did not continue, as some poor harvests, followed by problems relating to the construction of infrastructure done at the beginning of the Great Leap Forward, and many more elements, led to a series of problems, and in short, caused a significant amount of human suffering. In the years following this total fail, the agriculture sector was prioritized. Understandably, the Chinese authorities wanted to make sure that millions of people didn't die in a famine this time, so a new plan was put into force. This new plan tackled the following areas: technology, decentralization, and economic support. When it came to technology, the approach was simple: increase technological advancement in the agriculture sector. This took the form of the nation's resources being moved to the areas known to produce the highest and most reliable yields. So pumps, fertilizers, and irrigation system parts were allocated to the areas that would benefit the country the most. When it came to decentralization, the aim was to allow for the decision-making around production and the distribution of income from the yields to be made at a more local level and not a central system. This, in turn, was to help incentivize farmers and workers alike. And as for the economic support, the approach again was quite simple: lower taxes on the agricultural sector. And altogether, these approaches worked as agricultural produce averaged growth of almost 10% annually during the early 1960s. But in 1966, the Cultural Revolution began. And although the Cultural Revolution was primarily a political movement, its message of, in short, removing cultural elements that were not in line with Chinese communism, like capitalist influence, meant that the economy did see some turbulence. One of the impacts on the economy was a massive shortage of skilled individuals and technology, since imports of technology from abroad had seen a significant fall during the revolution, and universities were closed, meaning skilled individuals who could have helped contribute to technological advancement were not being fed into the economy. Throughout the remaining years of the Cultural Revolution, the economy performed pretty sluggishly. The political instability and power struggle within China caused economic growth to be relatively low for a country that was still at the time growing rapidly in a demographic sense. But after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, the protagonist of the Cultural Revolution, things politically began to change, and this was also the case economically, as a fresh approach to modernize and open up the Chinese economy were being taken into consideration, policies that would eventually make China's economy what it is today, which we will address in part 2 of this video series that we are doing about the Chinese economy. So be sure to subscribe to the channel to not miss out. Hey everyone, first of all, smash that like button, and if you want some Bitcoin and you want to support the channel at the same time, use my link below in the channel support box. Plus, if you're in the UK, you could get yourself a share worth up to £200 from a link below this video, so please go and check it out and support the channel. Otherwise, thank you so much for sticking around. To let me know you've watched the whole video, drop an emoji of your favourite fruit in the comment section. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next one. Take care. Bye.